Hi, I'm Connor Van Dyke, and it's my pleasure to interview Brandon Michaels, a former student of mine, and it's great to get some feedback today, hopefully, on what it's like teaching English overseas. So, welcome, Brandon.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Van Dyke. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So, um, the first thing I want to ask you is how did you get to be teaching English overseas?
Okay, so after I finished my bachelor's degree in 2016, it was in April, I was originally planning on pursuing after degree in education to go be an English teacher here.
Okay.
And about 4 days before I started that, I guess I sort of had a breakdown and I didn't really want to do that. So I canceled all my courses, I canceled everything, and I decided that I was going to teach in China. And that was the decision that I made. And so my parents were kind of furious about that. But I felt like throughout my life I was sort of following like a pattern where,
Okay.
like you go to high school and then you go to university and then you do something else and you follow the next obvious sort of thing. And I didn't really want to do that anymore. And so I just decided to do something that was, I guess, off the grid of what I think people are supposed to do.
And you figured, I guess, that you could always return to the regular pattern later, but you wanted to have this other unique experience.
Yeah, I think I definitely could go back. I don't think I will,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
that potential is always there, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think it was like that perfect age of going into different countries sort of thing. So I planned on going to China, and so I applied with a bunch of different agencies, and they're like, oh yeah, you seem like a good fit. And so then
Okay.
I signed contracts, I filled out health forms, and nobody in those countries really had any idea about the visa regulations and stuff. So I would get stuff sent back that was not allowed. Like they would say, oh,
Okay.
you're too young for our visa, or oh, you need this certificate. And then they wouldn't tell me until after it was denied. So I was very disappointed with the low ability of people to know their own visa regulations. I mean,
Okay,
I don't know our visa regulations here, so it's something that I guess I understand. But
So we're in Canada here, and I guess there are agencies on the ground here that are recruiting, or are you looking online?
I was looking online. I think that there are agencies in Canada, but I think that a lot of times you might have to go far away.
Okay.
And
So the online agencies, they are coming from a particular country, but they don't. They're working with specific schools, but they don't necessarily know their own country's regulations.
depending on where you are.
Okay.
So, I mean, some of these countries don't really have a lot of foreign teachers, so they don't really know how these things work.
Right.
And generally, sometimes it works and it doesn't, and they don't really know why it doesn't work until it happens.
Yeah. So you were looking just at Asia, or were you thinking of other places as well?
I was looking primarily at Asia because I think that is still the biggest market for ESL teaching.
Okay.
I mean, arguably the Middle East has gotten very big, but because they are willing to pay so much, you need to be an expert that's sort of shown that. So you need like the highest certification generally. You need multiple years experience.
Right. Yeah.
And that was not something that I had when I was applying for my first ESL job.
Okay. So if somebody is applying, what do you think is the minimum kind of experience they should have?
So I went in there with no experience and I did okay. But I think that generally if you want to go to Asia, you should at least have a certification. Not necessarily because it's essential for being a good teacher, but because it's good to have some sort of idea what you're doing. So you need to at least learn how to make a lesson plan and learn how to give students feedback on their sort of work. And I think that even though those courses aren't very good at doing that, they still do give you enough information to at least survive pretty well there.
Okay. Would you say it would be okay to take some education courses as part of your BA, let's say, or do you think that you really do need to take some follow-up courses or a diploma or something?
Well, I personally believe that there is no amount of education that will help you be a good teacher.
Okay.
And I mean, I think you could study in university for 6 or 7 years, and until you actually teach students, you
Right.
will not really have much of an idea of how it's done. And
No.
I mean, I just finished a certification course it's supposed to be what allows us to be teachers, and it was not very long, and I don't think I could take courses like that my entire life, and they would not help me as much as my first year of teaching taught me.
Okay. And your first year, where did you end up teaching?
So after my China plan didn't work out, I was basically given an ultimatum by my parents. It's either you go to a different country by March or you go to a different place. Basically, like it was like a sort of like a get out sort of thing, and I personally would choose going to a different country over homelessness any day. So I decided that even though China seemed easier to get into, I was going to go with Korea.
Okay.
And I mean, I never really knew that much about Korea, so it was the one country in Asia, like in the China, Japan, South Korea. They have like that triumvirate sort of thing where they control most of the ESL jobs.
Okay.
And I did not really know that much about Korea at all, so I was kind of worried when I went there, but I applied. It took me about 2 months to get everything done, and then I left on February 19th, 2017.
Okay. What would you say are the costs of applying? Like, as you get ready for this process, what might you expect? And what kinds of documents do you all need to fill out?
So generally there's a lot of paperwork that has to be sent to two places. You're going to have to send documents to Korea, usually via like UPS or DHL or some other
courier of some kind.
Yeah, some other sort of courier. And you're going to have to send a lot of documents to the embassy. So depending on where you're going, the embassy could be good or bad. So I think Japan and Korea for sure are in Vancouver. So that is a bit far away, especially if you want to do everything in person. I mean, it's like a 12-hour drive. But China is in Calgary. Their embassy is in Calgary. So if you do want to go to China, it's actually less difficult to do the paperwork.
Okay. And we're talking about the Canadian perspective here, being in Edmonton at the moment.
Yeah.
And the cost of all these documents?
So a list of documents you need. So you're going to need your university degree notarized. You're going to have to get a copy of that.
Yeah.
So that can be anywhere from $40 to $70.
Okay.
Depending on where you're going, you might need to do a health check before you get there. So in China, you have to do a health check before you get your visa. In Korea, you do it immediately when you get to the country.
Okay. So they take you and they
Yeah.
see if you're healthy enough.
Yeah, in South Korea, the way it is they pay for half. So you do the health check and you pay $100, well, 100,000 won, their money, and then they pay the other half, and then you go through it. And it's an interesting process because I remember when I did mine, and it took me 20 minutes, and I visited about 30 different stations. So
Wow.
eye check, sound check, blood test, urine test, everything. They make you do every sort of check possible.
Yeah.
And you're out of there so quickly that it's almost like going to like a theme park. It was a bewildering experience.
Did you get the results?
No.
Oh,
All
okay.
they said was you did okay.
Okay,
So
that's interesting.
yeah, I didn't fail it, so that's all that really matters, I guess.
Yeah. All right, so you went through all the applications and you decided on Korea. What was it like getting there? Were you nervous? Did you have some sense of what was going to happen, or how did you go into it?
So I was actually very nervous. It was the first time I ever left the country.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was a lot of firsts for me. First time I ever left the country, first time I ever went on my own, first time I ever saw the ocean. I mean, a lot of things that were different for me. And yeah, I was actually really nervous. I wasn't really nervous in the days going up to, but in that final day when I got to the airport, I was very almost shaking in a little bit.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, just because it was so different, and I was questioning, did I make the right decision a lot. And I mean, I got to the airport, and it was I flew to Seattle, and then it was like a 3-hour layover, and then 13, 14 hours to
Right.
Seoul.
Yeah.
And when I got there, I had to wait 5 hours for like a bus. And then the bus was going to take me to the center of the country. And then I was going to get picked up from there.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that didn't go as well as I thought, because when I got to the center of the country, the person that was supposed to pick me up didn't see me. And
Okay.
yeah,
There's nobody with a big sign.
yeah, there's nobody with a sign. And so I was at this bus station by myself. And at like 12:30, it was raining. I mean, when I left, it was snowing, so it wasn't as bad, but I was still freezing.
Yeah.
And I was looking for anybody that spoke English. And after walking this random street in the middle of this town I've never been to before without cell phone service, I found this one guy that spoke a little bit of English.
Okay.
And yeah, I asked him English, and he did this motion with his hand to show that he spoke a little bit. And he was a very nice guy. He took me into this convenience store. He let me borrow his. Actually, he didn't even have his phone on him. I asked him if I could make a phone call, and he ran back to his apartment to grab his phone, and he was gone for 20 minutes. And then he came back, and the only way I was connecting with my employer was through Skype. So he downloaded Skype on his phone, and then he let me log in, and I called my employer, and I had no idea where it was anyway, so I couldn't tell them where to pick me up or whatever. So he had to speak to them in Korean to tell them where I was.
Yeah.
And then he bought me 2 cans of coffee and said, "Go have a shower. It's okay."
Okay. Wow, that's nice. So
it was very nice. That was the first time the first night in Korea I saw extreme hospitality. So it was different, but I got through it.
Okay, so some initial nerves, and then definitely a story that ended up well.
Sort of. When I was in the car with my HR representative that picked me up, he was kind of telling me about how difficult my job was going to be, and he was saying, "Oh, if you're lucky, you might get off at 5 tomorrow because there isn't that much work, but you're going to get used to getting off really late at night." And he's telling me you have to wear a suit every Monday, which we didn't really have to. That was not true.
Okay.
And he was just scaring me.
Yeah.
And then I got to my apartment that day, or my room, and there was just like a empty single bed that felt like a rock. Right. And there was like sort of like blanket. It was like a small blanket with this little piece of cloth that was like supposed to be a sheet. And he's like, "Yeah, you have to be up at 8 o'clock." And by the time I got to that room, it was like 3. And I remember I called up my father and was like, "I don't think I can stay here for a year. This is terrible." And I felt so regretful in that night. I was so nervous.
Okay, so you might suggest to people thinking about doing this that there's going to be a great deal of feelings about being vulnerable, about being alone, not knowing your rights, not being able to be confident in terms of dealing with others, perhaps. Would that be accurate?
I think, especially initially, that was the case. I think depending on where you go, it can not be like that. I mean, that was the first night I was there. I felt really alone, but that went away within the next like 12 hours.
Oh, okay, that's good.
So on the second day, I met some of the other foreign teachers that were from the United States, and they took me out shopping. They were like, okay, they bought me lunch. They showed me where to get like outlets so I could plug in my stuff, since I didn't have Korean outlets.
Okay, so that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, if you're going to another country, it's important to see what kind of outlets they use so you can charge your phone and everything. It helps a lot. So that's an important thing that I think people might miss.
Yeah, we had that too. We went to New Zealand last year, and you have these universal converters or chargers that you can change up, but they don't always work perfectly either, so you have to be careful. All right, so now that you got to the place, you got to know some people, what were those first few weeks like? Was it a lot of work? The kids react well? How did it meet your expectations?
So when I got there, I was told this. It was February 20th when I got there, and I was told the semester starts like March 3rd. So I had about 2 weeks or so to plan all the classes I was going to be teaching and everything. And I mean, as somebody that never really taught anything, it was kind of very difficult.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know the students, I didn't know what their level could be, I didn't know what to expect from them, and I didn't really know the course material that well either. So,
did they give you some textbooks? Is that?
For a couple of the courses they did, there was one of the courses I was teaching, which was an English communication course, which is just to help the middle school students like speak English more.
Okay.
So that was a different one.
Yeah. And how did the students do? Like, what was your impression of the students?
So, on my first day of class, I had 3 classes. It was a grade 9 literature class, followed by a grade 11 literature class, and then at the end of the day, it was that 9th grade communication course. So the first 9th grade class, I walked in, I was talking to them, and I was trying to like say some nice things, and I immediately realized these kids are all punks. Almost all of them were just punks. And as I found, they're very sweet punks, but they were still punks. They were disrespectful. They didn't really want to do anything. And it was very difficult. After the end of that class, I just felt like, what happened? They considered me to be some sort of like old man almost. And I was like 5 years older than some of them. So it was weird. And then I had the grade 11 class, and they were a little bit like punks, but they were a lot better. They were very respectful. Their English was a lot better, so they could understand a lot of the jokes I was saying. So that was really good. That class went really well, and a lot of the students were very impressed by me because I was only 23 at the time. And in Korea, they use a different aging system. So when when people are born, they just use the age 1. So you're 1 when you start. And
Really? Okay.
And a lot of the students, they graduate at around 19 or 20 because of the schooling system. They have 2 years of kindergarten, and so a lot of the students start late. So a lot of them were like, they were 20 years old or whatever, and I'm 23, and I'm teaching them, and they're like, "Oh, you're a genius. You're so young. You must have skipped every class," which seems like it would be interesting and good, but it didn't help me because they found my work so difficult, and then they would blame it because it's like, "Oh, you're a genius. You expect us to be geniuses too." But yeah.
So is there a temptation then in terms of making the work easier so you can be friends with them, or do you feel a duty to pull them up? Like, how are you being assessed in terms of the work you do and whether you're being effective?
So we were a private school, and that means that essentially the parents control everything. So I mean, if I was making it too easy, then the kids would probably complain that they weren't learning anything, and then their parents would be like, "Why am I paying so much money for this?"
Yeah.
And if the kids complain they're not learning anything because it's too difficult, then you get the same problem. So you have to try to balance it so that kids feel like they're learning things, but not too difficult. I was never very good at that because I always just was like, I'm going to make it as difficult as I think it needs to be. And I understand that you're not native speakers, but if it was an international school and these students all plan on going to the United States,
Okay.
and so I didn't want to give them this false sort of expectation that, the school system's going to go easy on you because you're Korean. If you want to succeed in the United States, you need to be able to do this stuff. And if you can't, then I don't want you to waste your money and your time finding out that it's difficult 3 years from now when you spend thousands of dollars on tuition.
Yeah.
So.
Did you have any strange experiences with parents or students? Anything that you would advise people thinking about teaching English overseas that they should be aware of or cautious about when it comes to teaching?
Yeah, I think I'll go over a few of them. On my first day, so I talked about my first 2 classes, but my third class, I was waiting in my classroom for my students to show up. And I waited 5 minutes after the bell and no one was there. And then one of the grade 9 students comes up to me and he says, "Teacher, class is upstairs. Why are you here?" And I was confused. And so then I go upstairs and there was 49 students in this class and it was supposed to be only 20.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. Luckily, it was only a 50-minute class, so I tried to figure out a way to make it look like I was teaching them without having any plan, because I only had 20-something syllabi, and I didn't plan on this many, so I just had them all speak an English word that I would have them repeat after I said it.
Okay.
And that was just a way to kill the clock before I told the head of my department what the problem was, and then we got it all fixed. We split it into 2 classes, but that was a nightmare. That was terrifying. Teaching 48 grade 9 students that don't want to listen to anything is, you can't get anything done like that.
So be aware of unexpected situations and try to manage and work them out. Okay.
Yeah. So unexpected situations with parents. I had parent-teacher conference once a semester, so twice every year. And the first semester, it was kind of fine, I guess. It wasn't that great. I had one mother who came in who her son wasn't doing too bad. He was getting like 80s.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, he's doing pretty well. He's a good student in class. I like him a lot. And then she's like, no, he's not. He's lazy. He doesn't work hard enough. He's terrible. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to agree with her. So I said, yeah, he's lazy. He needs to work harder. He's not working hard enough in class. He's always sleeping. And she's like, yeah, I'm going to yell at him. And I was like, please do. and so I felt kind of bad that I threw him under the bus like that. But the parents control everything. In the second semester, it was a lot different. There was a lot more positives and negatives. So I had some parents who would come in and they'd be like, you don't even know what you're doing because my child says she's not learning anything. She says you're not fair. She says you mark students unfair.
Okay.
And they question your integrity sometimes, which was interesting because, I remember that child and she did not want to be there at all. But I also had parents come in and say, oh, my child says you're such a great teacher. You're amazing. She loves your class. Yeah. She learns so much. And so
those experiences are really rewarding.
Yeah, it felt really good when you had parents that would come in. I remember I had a couple of Canadian parents who would come in and they would ask me about what Canadian universities to go to.
Okay.
And I was like, well, I only went to one, but I'm familiar with the other ones, and these are the ones that are the highest ranked in Canada, and these are what they specialize in. So,
and again, I think this notion of not just listening to the negatives, but being able to figure out, okay, this is working well, parents like this or students like that, and really focusing on building that up, I think is probably important. Because again, you're so vulnerable by yourself that your self-esteem is something you have to struggle with, I think.
Yeah. When I taught in that first semester communication class for the grade 9 students, I didn't really know what it was supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And so it just went really, really poorly. But in the second semester, it was the similar course for the grade 10 students. But since I realized there was not really restrictions on it, I could just do with it what I wanted. So I just turned it into a debate class where students would just debate certain topics that I would let them pick out. So one week they'd be talking about if the Earth is flat or not, because they were all hearing all these conspiracy theories, which I thought was funny. Yeah. And one week they were talking about if video games are good for you or bad, or cell phones, or if it's okay to spank people. And not only was this really good because I forced students to speak in English, it was also good because it was some of the funniest banter I've ever heard in my entire life. Okay. I just think about it even to this day. It's been 5 months since I did that, and it just makes me laugh every time I think about how, not necessarily rude, but just brazen those kids were, and how they just kept saying whatever they thought was a good point, but it wasn't. And it was so funny.
So would you say too then that part of the joy of doing this is this kind of cultural immersion of finding out what a different culture is like, and not seeing that as a threat necessarily, but just seeing it as something, an experience to really appreciate?
Yeah. So when I first got to Korea, I was walking in the farmlands because I lived in the middle of nowhere, and it was really weird for me because I would just be walking down the street like normal, and I would see Korean farmers that were like grabbing and pulling out their rice and stuff, and it was interesting. And then after a few months, I was just walking down the street like normal, and I forgot that I was in Korea, and then I thought about it for a second, and I realized I'm in Korea, and I just got so excited because it sort of starts to normalize a bit, and you definitely get sucked into the culture, and it's a really good thing. I think that's one of the best things about it, is getting to see the way things are different and experience the differences. And I think whenever people go to a country and live in a different country, you're going to come back and start to look at your own country and be like, oh, why isn't it like that? Why do we have all these problems? And I mean, no country's perfect, but I think that is one of the immersion is definitely one of the best things about living in a different country for sure.
What do you think are some lessons that Canadians can learn from Koreans that you picked up on, other than having really good internet and so on, at least in places?
Yeah, they have really good internet there. I think there's a lot of lessons that we could learn. I think one of the things is that the government doesn't baby people as much. So there's a lot of social restrictions that people have to do. So they have to bow, they have to speak in a certain way to people that are older than them.
Okay.
But they don't have a lot of legal restrictions. So like things like drinking in public, people don't really do that, but they don't see it as being a really bad thing because it's not like, I mean, when people drink there, they're not causing fights all the time. Children are left unattended because they're not that worried about them because people don't necessarily want to hurt them there, and it's a very safe thing. And I guess that's not really a lesson. That's more of just like a comparison. Like this is better, but
things that we take for granted, right?
Yeah.
Like the way we supervise children or the way we construct laws. That sometimes is really healthy to see how a different society does that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely less of a child state there, where there's social restrictions, but they don't really have legal restrictions. Like you can buy fireworks, whatever you want, which I don't necessarily think is a good thing. But I think a lot of the lack of laws, I don't necessarily want to do all these things, but I think that it's good to be able to. That's what I really like about it, is that if I want to sit in a taxi while the taxi driver's driving and drink whiskey, I can do that. I don't necessarily want to do that, but it's nice to have those options because I don't see why it's a problem for a lot of those things.
Okay.
So that's one of the things, is that maybe we don't need to worry so much about controlling things in Canada, because I think it definitely goes against people's freedom to just live their own life as long as they're not hurting or causing distress to other people.
And some of these things can be done through education as well. Education is a kind of legislative thing too, in the way it teaches us. Yeah. Speaking of a kind of legal vacuum, can you say anything about what kind of financial or legal things people should be aware of when they go overseas?
So there's definitely some laws that are just different in every country. So I mean, it can range from really basic things like what side of the road they drive on and traffic laws, to just things like where you're living. Like for example, in Korea, when you sign up for an apartment, you have to give them what's called key money, which can be $10,000 to $20,000 like Canadian.
Oh wow, yeah.
Which you're not necessarily giving them that money, but it's basically like insurance, because the way real estate laws work is that it's very difficult to evict people in Korea. So if you do something bad, they'll say, well, I'll take your money, sort of thing.
Okay, so this would be like a month's rent for us, but they're expecting a lot more.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's a basic thing. But I mean, as far as financial, I think that when you go to one of these countries, it's important to bring some money.
Right.
And I think depending on how your contract's set up, you might need more or less. So, for example, in China, a lot of the times housing is not included in your contracts. So if you don't have housing, then you better bring more money. In Korea, generally housing is included. And I mean, health insurance is generally included too. So you basically only need enough money to fulfill until you have your first month. I was lucky when I was teaching because we had a cafeteria that had lunch and dinner every day. So I didn't really bring that much money. I brought like $400, and that lasted me my first paycheck, my second paycheck, because I mean, you don't really need that much money when you have food taken care of, and you need like toilet paper. That's about it. I didn't really have anything I needed. I mean,
Okay. So, how much time did you have for things like excursions, seeing the rest of the country? What kind of freedom do you have when you teach overseas?
So people that go to different countries for teaching and expect to travel a lot, I mean, I feel you might be a little disappointed because it's not like you can go out every day and just go explore. I mean, that's not necessarily true for me because in Korea, since a lot of the cities are very close, especially outside Seoul, you can go to a different city every day pretty much. But you might have more or less depending on how much you're working. And one of the things I'd advise people is don't sign a contract that has more money and more work, because then you're just missing out on the best reason to go to these countries, so that you can explore them and see different things. I mean, China's very big, so one of my friends is working there, and he only goes to a different city maybe twice, 3 times a year.
Oh, wow.
So he's kind of stuck there. But I mean, I was in Korea for a year and I visited 20 different cities, 20 something different cities. But a lot of the times that would be on the vacations that we had, the vacation periods, or especially on the weekends. Because Korea has such a great bus system that you can essentially get anywhere on their buses in the country under 6-7 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a benefit. I mean, you will have to work weekends probably at your job sometimes, so you can't go out every weekend. But I could go out almost every weekend. I mean, I didn't necessarily want to because...
Just do your lesson plan on the bus.
yeah, you could do your lesson plan on the bus. You could take the train. There's the transportation in Asia is really, really good. I mean, in Japan, they have the bullet train, which I wouldn't advise doing that every weekend because it's very expensive.
Right.
But you can explore. You will definitely have time to explore, but you have to use your time as best as you can.
Yeah.
So you're going to have weekends, you're going to have public holidays, you're going to have different instances where you can stay home and relax, or you can go explore. And I think it's good to balance them. I think going out every weekend, if you go explore every weekend, you're going to get sick of it. But I think that having that good balance between exploring on the weekends and on your holidays, and maybe one weekend you just stay home. Yeah. I think that's what was really nice. And I definitely enjoyed exploring Korea, and I think that going to different cities is really cool because they have different stores. They have especially right now in Korea, it's very big into bakeries and cafes. So you go and you'll see in Seoul they have a cafe that has sheep, and you can go sit with sheep. Or you can go see an owl, or you can go sit and drink coffee while puppies are trying to get treats from you. There's people there they're always trying to do things that are a little bit different. Yeah. And so in every town you go into, you're going to see different places like that, and it's really great to just do that sort of thing. I mean, and also the scenery there is a lot different. Like, for example, I didn't know this before I left, but Korea is covered in hills and mountains. The entire country is mountainous. And when the first time I noticed this was when we left my town to go to this other church thing. And it was almost like watching that island that King Kong lives on. And you just see these huge mountains that are like hundreds of feet tall. And it's just crazy that it looks like that. I was amazed at how nice it was. So use your time as best as you can, but don't go exploring all the time because then you'll get tired of it and exhausted.
You gotta leave something for another weekend, I guess.
Yeah. Balance.
Some final questions here, maybe. Learning the language. What do you think about that? Should people start ahead of time, or can they ignore it, or is it kind of critical? What do you think?
So anybody that expects to learn the language by teaching in a different country they will be very disappointed because you're not going to be able to just pick it up, especially with languages like Chinese and Korean and Japanese. They're very difficult to learn like that. I think it's important to have a basic knowledge of the languages, and especially with things like maybe like knowing what the food is. Right. That would be very helpful. I mean, there were so many times when I was eating in Korea at the cafeteria, and someone would tell me what it was in Korean, and I'd be like, I have no idea what that is. And then it would come on my plate, and they'd be like, oh. Like, I had an anglerfish one time, and that was a scary thing to eat. But so I do wish that I learned a little bit of Korean before I left, because when I left I knew nothing. I didn't even know how to say hello. So I think the first word I ever learned in Korean was like dad jokes, because I made a really lame joke and my Korean American friend said, "Oh, that's aje gegu," which means like old man gag, and so he taught me how to say that my joke was really bad. So I think it's important to know a bit of the language. You can improve your language ability when you get there, but it's good to know, especially things like the numbers and especially the alphabet. Korean is very good because they have a very simple alphabet that's really easy to understand. So if anybody wants to go to Korea, there's a lot of apps that you can download, and if you just memorize the alphabet, that'll get you so far. With Chinese, like Mandarin, and with Japanese, the language is very difficult when it comes to the alphabet.
Right, the characters. There's many more characters.
There's so many, and although Korean is probably the most difficult out of the three languages to speak, so it kind of evens out. Japanese, the sounds are very similar to English, so it's a lot easier.
Okay.
But yeah, I think knowing a bit of the language would be very helpful, especially just like simple sentences like how to order food or how to ask for something. I mean, that stuff would get you really far. And especially just thank you or sorry or please. Yeah. Like just that sort of thing it's important just because, I mean, not only should you use that, I think it's a good starting point, and it shows people that even if you can't speak, at least you're respectful.
Right, yeah. So you started by talking about hospitality, and you're kind of concluding by saying, well, you got to reciprocate somehow, right?
Yeah, I mean...
Respond.
Yeah, I was treated so well in Korea, and I think it's probably a common thing. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't think that they would be so open to foreigners. I guess they're not open to all types of foreigners, but I was treated very, very well there. Mm-hmm. Especially old people. Old people there are the friendliest people I've ever met. The elderly people there are, especially the women. I mean, the women are very aggressive in a kind way. So if they think you're hungry, they'll try to force you to eat food. Like they're almost like your own grandmother, even though you look nothing like them and they have no connection to you. Yeah. And I mean, I remember I was on the subway one time and I was standing because there was elderly people and I don't want to take up a seat for them. But then that seat opened up and these old ladies just pulled me down into the seat. They were like, sit down with us. And
that's great.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about is how well are you going to work with the other Korean people or the Japanese people, because I think that there are cultural differences that might make it difficult to work with them, and that's something that a lot of my other American and my South African coworkers sort of experienced sometimes, was that when they were there was definitely a divide between the foreign teachers and the Korean teachers. Yeah. So I mean, our contracts are different, we get different things, we're treated differently, and sometimes the vice principal would say, oh, these are the best teachers in the school, the foreign teachers, and which I thought was not a very good thing, because it kind of puts a target on your back. And personally, I don't think we were. I mean, we weren't the worst, but I think that the first thing that you should ever do when you go to do one of these teaching contracts is getting rid of the perception that people are different. Because as I learned, especially being there, people are exactly the same wherever you go. I mean, there are a few cultural differences that change people, but if you're a kind person and you are open to being who you are, people will love you. And I was loved there. I mean, one of my best experiences was I had this art teacher that worked at the school. Yeah. And she did not speak very much English at all. And yet she would always want to walk around and speak the basic English she could with me rather than speak to the other Korean teachers, because we started around the same time and she got very close to me. Right. So that was, I mean, I remember one time it was 11 p.m. and I was in bed and she knocked on my door, and I opened my door and I saw her and she was holding a jar and she just held it up and she wanted me to open it for her because she couldn't do it because she was so small. And then I opened it and she said thank you, and then I went back to bed, and she did that a couple times. Yeah. And it's just, it's interesting that language doesn't really divide people as much as I thought. I had one student that when I first started teaching, I would call her name, and she didn't speak any English, and so she would just shake because she was so terrified. And by the end of the semester, her English didn't really get any better, but she was very comfortable around me. So as she was leaving the school, she needed a ride, and there was 12, 15 Korean teachers that she could talk to. But she comes up to me and she says, hand phone, which is cell phone, and she needed to make a call. And so whenever she would see me, she would always be very happy. Even though she couldn't understand what I was saying in the class, she could just tell that, you know, we had a strong sort of connection because I definitely cared about her.
Yeah, and you were able to help out where you were helped out at the beginning.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts that you would like to share in terms of anything we missed, or that prospective foreign teachers could benefit from? What do you think?
Well, I think there's a few things that I want to talk about. I think everybody should do this at least once. I think it doesn't really matter what age you are, especially. No one's, I mean, I guess for visa restrictions, you might be too old at like 55 or 60, but I don't think anyone's really too old to do this.
Okay.
I think that...
And it's not just English students either. It could be different. You could have a history degree, let's say. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Generally, they, as long as you have a bachelor's a lot of the time, sometimes you don't even need that. So depending on where you're going, there's different restrictions. Like if you want to go to South America, for example, all you need is a simple certification course and you can get in. You don't necessarily need a bachelor's. And then for Asia, you need a bachelor's. And then for the Middle East, you need a bachelor's and a master's or experience or a teaching certification plus 5 years experience a lot of time. So, I mean, it depends on where you're going to see what you need. But yeah, generally, I mean, English might be preferred in a lot of cases because they somehow think that if you study literature, you're better at linguistics.
Right.
Which I think is possibly true, but I don't see how the connection is very much there in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, probably what's happening is that in those countries, when they teach a language, they focus very much on structure and linguistics. Whereas in North America, when we teach English at the university level, we focus much more on literature than on things like composition and grammar.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of disconnect there, perhaps.
Yeah. So yeah, anybody with a bachelor's can pretty much go to Asia. Okay. There's no sort of requirement as far as what your major, your specialization has to be. So anyone that studied chemistry, don't fret. You can definitely go down there and you can teach just as much as I did. But yeah, what else should I talk about? Final thoughts. Yeah, I think everybody should do this. I think that it is one of those experiences that most people should get nervous doing. It is a big decision, but as far as I know, everyone that I've talked to has enjoyed the experience when it comes to teaching in Korea and Japan and China. I think other things you should really look at are how much the currency actually goes in their own country.
Right, yeah.
So,
cost of living, things like that.
Yeah, so especially cost of living. That's one of the reasons I would recommend Korea over Japan, because in Japan you might get paid a bit more, but everything is so much more expensive that it's not going to go as far.
Right.
But in Korea, you get paid a lot of money generally, and the cost of living there is not high at all. So you can live pretty luxuriously. I mean, I don't think I could have gone through my month's salary if I tried.
Okay.
Maybe if I tried really hard, but
yeah.
But yeah, so cost of living and knowing the currency, but yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of things that I could say, but
I think we've probably exhausted the topic somewhat.
Yeah, I think that everybody should do this, and yeah, I mean, Korea is probably the best place to go. I want to advertise Korea a little bit because it's much more structured than a place like China. The cost of living is less than Japan, and you have more freedom than the Middle East, even though you make less money. So if you want to go to the Middle East and you have 4 years experience and you have teaching certification and that sort of thing, well, I think that's a good decision, but in a lot of ways you're trading the freedom of living in an open country for more money. Which I guess if you got to pay off those student loans, that's fair.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, I think the best reason to go to a different country is just the experience. I mean, money's great, but I think the experience is why you want to go there. So don't sign any contracts that you have to work too hard. Don't sign any contracts where you're getting underpaid, because you have to remember that you have a bachelor's degree and you speak English, and
Right.
if you have any experience doing this even at home, you're kind of a commodity. So don't sell yourself short when it comes to how valuable you can be in these countries.
Yeah.
They can never get enough ESL jobs. I mean, if you go online, you'll find thousands of these places. There's thousands of schools in China that are always hiring.
Yeah.
There's thousands of schools in Korea that are always hiring. In Japan.
So be patient and be selective and know what you're in for.
Yeah, and do the stuff in advance, because if you don't do it in advance, you might realize that the process is going to take you a lot longer than you anticipated, because
And you might take shortcuts and make mistakes.
yeah, and especially when it comes to the visa stuff, you have to know that these things don't happen overnight. They can be weeks of waiting, and it's going to cost you a bit of money up front. I mean, the schools definitely don't pay for the visa application. They don't pay for things like
The health checks.
the
and
health
things
check
like that.
initially.
Yeah.
They don't pay for a lot of the stuff, and so you might think, why am I paying this out of pocket? But you have to understand that the way that the application works is just different, and they assume that you will pay for it because you want to go there. And another thing is, I would personally recommend that don't ever sign a contract where you don't have housing, because a lot of the real estate laws in these different countries are just weird.
Okay.
Like in China, when you pay rent, you have to pay for it tri-monthly, so you do it by 3 months rent, which is just, it's kind of a hassle. In Korea, they have that key money that I talked about earlier, and in Japan, they have other laws too that I'm not that familiar with, but I've heard their real estate is a problem too. So, I mean, it's save yourself the hassle and try to find a school that will pay for your flight and that will pay for like your housing and basic needs, and because you are pretty valuable to them. And I guess I didn't really talk too much about Europe, but in Europe there's so many people that speak English that speak both of the languages, so they're not really interested in ESL as far as someone that only speaks English. So if you're fluent in French or Spanish, then those places are pretty good, but they're not going to pay for your flight and they're not going to pay for your housing, because they just see it as another job. So
know the market and know your opportunities.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brandon. This has been really enlightening and interesting, and I hope people really benefit from this. If you do have any questions, then just post them below, and we will see if we can get a response.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.